Okay, I reckon that's running now. It is. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to ask Rosie for confirmation that everyone can see my slides.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. Lovely. Let's just get the old chat box open. We're on. Marvellous. Right. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to think and plan your work intelligently. And all this stuff comes from a book that rather brilliantly came out on the first day of lockdown at the end of March. So obviously sales have been fantastic because everyone can rush into the bookstores. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm going to take you through this stuff, and it's a visual guide to sorting out the way that you think and do things. Okay, there's someone just came on there. If you could mute, that would be lovely. Thank you. Okay, so you should all have a PDF of this book, and it comes from a series. This is not a big ad necessarily, but just as you know, lots of other books in these series that we've written, and lots of topics that we regularly train with Havas. So if you're interested in those, just keep an eye on campus or ask people in L&D and they'll tell you all about them. So I'm going to crack on now. And first of all, we're going to talk about thinking. And what I'll do is I'll give you 5 areas and things to think about over the space of about 15 minutes. And then we'll have a good old chat. But if you want to ping in ideas on the way, then we'll keep an eye on the chat bar as well. So first of all, let's think about thinking. And a question that I usually rhetorically ask almost everybody in business these days is, who's got enough time to think? And if you want, we can put that right in the chat bar now. And if you want to ping in whether you do or you don't, let's just see if any remarks come in about that. Who has got enough time to think? And Nick Dodds immediately says, no, I don't. And isn't that interesting? And it really does pay to think about thinking. And what I mean by that is too much time. Well, Rebecca's got too much time. Lucy says she's got not as much as I would like. Isn't that interesting? So Rebecca, when you say you've got too much time, do you mean you've got too much time to think because you're now working at home? I'd be interested to know the distinction.
Yes, I'd say it's exactly that. I'm not rushing around. I'm not trying to catch my tube. I'm not trying to get from place to place.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know. I find, I'm not saying that work doesn't get in the way, because work always gets in the way of thinking time, but there's a lot of time just sat at home. So yeah, I feel like I've got more time, but interesting that people feel differently.
Yeah, isn't it just? And thank you for chipping in. And I see from Dom, who says, I've got more than I've ever had, but less right now. Now, let's just quickly go through some of the bits that are going on there, because it's quite interesting. So broadly speaking, assuming we weren't in lockdown, most people in business, particularly in fast-moving businesses like comms, will actually tell you that they don't have enough time. Now, that may be practically true in as much as the diary is packed. But if you think it through logically, if you do not think about what you're doing before you do all that stuff, there's probably a very high chance that you actually don't know why you're doing all that stuff, and you may therefore be doing the wrong stuff. So I strongly commend to everybody, please set aside some thinking time for yourself of an appropriate amount, even if that's 15 minutes at the beginning or end of each day, just to think. Because if you don't think before you do, then you might be doing all the wrong stuff. So that's a broad principle when you're busy. It is interesting, lots of clients are telling me that weirdly, even though you're at home, all these Zoom calls are actually back to back, and you barely get time to nip to the loo and make a cup of tea, and they stack on the hour, on the hour. I was saying to Rosie just before this started that when we first had lockdown and were doing online training, very diligent people would often log on 10 minutes beforehand, and then you'd have a nice little chat, and then you would indeed start on the hour. Doesn't happen anymore. As you saw from then, everyone logs on a minute or two after the hour, and the whole thing's kick and rush because it's back to back. So I'm putting the thought in your mind to think about thinking. Of course, the other end of it is what Rebecca is saying, is I've actually got too much time on my hands. In which case, please adopt some of these ideas for really thinking about yourself and your work, because you suddenly then do have some time. Let's give you some ideas about how to make good use of it. Okay, so the first point I want to make on thinking is a highly personal one, and it's all about the difference between work you and normal you. Now, as people who know me quite well know that I do love a diagram, and here, as I say it here are two circles. I'm suggesting that one of these circles represents what you're like normally, and I use that in parentheses, normal, like that, or work you. Now, this is particularly relevant if you physically go to a place of work. And some people almost draw a deep breath and think, right, I'm off to work now. How am I going to behave? So the thinking for your own persona, if you like, is what degree of distinction or difference should there be between work me and personal me? Now, in this somewhat dramatic version here, this individual is utterly different in their normal social life than they are at work. And so the question to everybody is that okay? And is that you? What do you reckon? Is it okay to be totally different? Let's just see what happens. Yeah, I love that. If he says no, it would be exhausting. No, you'll burn yourself out. I like that. Yeah. To sit on the fence, I'd say it depends. But my instinct is to say no, that's Tony. Yeah. Dom says, I find it knackering trying to project being someone else. That's fascinating. Yeah. So it's doable, but not sustainable. It's too hard to not be authentic. Yeah, I like that, Fariba. Be a slightly more refined version of yourself, but on the whole, yourself. That's very delicately put. I like that. Rebecca says, I've always felt less happy at work when I felt I've had to suppress my personality. What a fantastic set of comments. Thank you. So what's going on here as a broad piece of philosophy is that we want to try and get a decent overlap in the Venn diagram between you being normal. I would suggest that this bit of overlap here, which looks like it's about 10% or something, is not enough. This is better, and this is where you want to be. So as a rough rule of thumb, if you can be yourself, that's great. It's less stress for you. It's much more rich and diverse for the entire team, and it's better. And it's particularly important if you look at this little bit down here, is that they often call this covering. You know, you cover up what you really are. You go into work, it's draining, and it's not a good equation because, of course, people aren't getting the full benefit of your character. So that is the philosophy. Being yourself at work is good, and of course, being at work now includes being at home. I think they called it working from home before, WFH, and now it's called LITO, which is living in the office. In other words, you are living in your office at home, which is the opposite. It's just a different physical place. Okay, right, so that's my first little bit of philosophy there. I'm now moving on to attitude when you're thinking, and there's a little exercise here called 3 good, 3 bad. Now, one of the fascinating things about the comms industry in particular is that most of the people in it are relentlessly cheerful, and it's absolutely lovely, and everybody's optimistic. And if you think about it, people get hired for their character and personality, but in many instances, there's very little check on your technical skills beforehand. Now, I'm not saying there are none, but if you can contrast the recruitment process of comms, PR, advertising, the whole shoot, there are very few technical checks in the way that there would be if somebody, for example, were joining an accountancy practice, an architect, and so forth, where technical proven skills, engineering, all that stuff absolutely have to be to the fore. And that's what they need most. And then the character is less of a big deal. So what tends to happen in comms is that everybody's relentlessly enthusiastic, and it's charming. However, often it glosses over the really tough stuff that needs to be attended to at the beginning of any project, or in some cases might be just a brief. And so this technique, 3 good, 3 bad, is deliberately designed to help you think, how difficult is this thing really? Rather than just saying, yeah, we can do that, that's easy. And a lot of people in agencies struggle with this because they get a brief from a client. They say, yeah, we can do that. That's absolutely fine. Done loads of those before. It's all marvelous. Ding dong dong, marvelous. And everything's up. But this is not what happens in other industries. So instead, what we do with 3 good, 3 bad is say, right, at the beginning of the project or the brief, get everybody to write down the 3 best things about the brief, the brand, the product, anything that we're dealing with, and the 3 worst. And the worst bit is crucial. In other words, we're flashing out all the really tricky stuff. Now, if we were doing long training on this, I would immediately say to you, who's ever worked on a really crap brand? And you can ping examples in the chat bar if you want to. And it's usually hilarious. So usually every hand goes up. Say, oh God, yeah, absolutely. And equally, who's ever worked on a crap brief? And of course, the answer to that is, whoa, yeah, almost every brief I get is crapped. That's brilliant. Sorry, Abby's just pinged in Mecca Bingo. There you go. Yeah. Some amazing brands with abysmal briefs. Exactly. And of course, the briefing process is frequently a disaster or non-existent. So what often happens is, if we get a brief, Caroline says, exactly. So it's the duty, the professional duty, if you like, of you, the gatekeeper and recipient of this brief or new project or whatever the thing is, to say, right, what exactly is at stake here? What's all the good stuff about it? And what's all the bad? Crucially, the bad. Now, a lot of people, if you ask them, what kind of brands would you like to work on? They will give you answers of all apparently beautiful and lovely brands like Apple and Adidas and Virgin and this and that. The interesting thing in comms is that you don't get promoted and win awards for doing work on lovely brands that are already regarded as so cool that they almost market themselves. Where you get the accolades is by taking something really quite nasty and difficult and doing something really intelligent or impressive with it that changes perceptions. Example, at the beginning, everybody hated Skoda. And by the time they'd done a proper addressing campaign on it, they changed perceptions tremendously. So this is a way of looking at things differently. So you write down all the good stuff and all the bad stuff. Clearly, if the good stuff massively outweighs the bad, then that will become the focus and epicenter of any brief that you're working on. And that's perfectly fine with one small caveat, and that is you shouldn't and mustn't ignore something that's in the negative column, which is really quite substantial and detrimental, because it's possible that just that one thing will outweigh all the good stuff about the brand. On the other hand, what do you do if there's a huge amount of negative stuff, some bad stuff about it? Bad brief, bad brand. And then the answer is don't panic. Because what will happen then is that when you analyze the stuff down here, this will become the epicenter of the brief. In other words, to address perceptions of the brand that are lousy based on this, to attend to this difficult issue here, to change people's opinions of, etc., all down here. And so suddenly now, the bad stuff isn't bad anymore. It's just the target of what we must do and get to grips with. And now, at last, but at the beginning of the process, we're actually being honest about how difficult things could well be. And if you think that through logically, then that could be tremendously beneficial, in as much as you say, right, client, we've identified that we've got this really, really tricky thing to grapple with here. And it's immediately apparent, therefore, that a very small budget is not going to do the job. And so there are lots of ways in which you can turn this to your advantage. So in summary, confronting bad stuff at the start is a really, really, really good thing to do. Pretending that it's not there isn't a good thing to do. And finally, what's essential personally about that is do bear in mind that if you either accept a non-brief or a flawed brief, but you don't say anything about it, then I'm afraid you become complicit in it. And then when you're doing the post-campaign review a few months later, it's no good really then saying, well, we knew it wouldn't work, because in fact, it's your professional duty to point it out and do something about it at the beginning. So to avoid general angst at the end of stuff, if you know at the beginning that there's trouble in there, get it out on the table and we'll work out what to do about it rather than just grin and bear it. Okay, so if anyone wants to comment on that, by the way, just ping any notes in the chat bar and I'll attend to them. I'm going to do 3 more ideas on this and then we'll have a chat anyway. Okay, so I want to talk now about enthusiasm. And this is the thing I call the motivational dip. And most people have a chuckle about this because they say, oh yeah, I had a relationship like this. So let's see what happens. On this axis here, this is essentially a degree of energy and commitment and enthusiasm to whatever the thing is that we need to do. And going along this axis is time. And the fascinating thing about it is that this time bit can be really, really short or incredibly long, which I'll explain in a minute. So what is the usual cycle? Well, the first thing that happens is, yay, we've got a new toy. This is exciting. We've got a new brief, a new thing, a new client, a new anything. And so our enthusiasm is, yay, up we go like this. And at a certain point, there's a dip and it's, oh, the motivational dip. Oh God, this isn't as interesting as if we thought it was. Oh God. Now, if you're a designer, and you know, I say this with a slight tongue-in-cheek, but we've had a lot of discussions with designers. They can be very excited on Monday morning getting the brief and already demotivated by Tuesday afternoon because they've discovered all sorts of stuff about it that they don't like. So there's a motivational dip. And after that, then we have to go into a new phase of learning and understanding about what the thing really, really involves. And once you've done that, hopefully we're going upward toward a successful conclusion, execution of brief, clever idea or whatever. Or unfortunately though, if not, just moving my chat bar there, then it may all go horribly wrong. And some people laugh about this because this is essentially, you know, what happens at the end of a bad relationship. You know, oh dear, it didn't work after that. I'm just going to check a little comment here from Dom in the chat bar. It says, I wonder if the drive to be unrealistically positive is structural within agencies, a legacy of the pitching process and the importance of client relationships. Yes, it definitely is. I agree with that, Dom. And what I'm really pointing out to agencies is that whilst that is charming and charismatic on one hand, it can lead to terrible trouble on the other. Because if you go to a management consultant or an architect or an accountant or an engineer, they don't say, yeah, that's great, we can knock that up by Friday. They say, yeah, you're right, you've got an issue with that. But from our analysis, we also think you've got an issue with this and this. And this is a thing we call rational drowning, because by being rational, you're making people think harder about their stuff and almost allowing them to drown a little bit. But don't worry, you're going to pull them out of that with some helpful responses afterwards. And typically, a more thoughtful, less optimistic attitude at the beginning usually leads to higher quality work, being paid more for it, and being viewed more strategically as a result. And of course, agencies are always complaining that they're not at the strategic top table, and this is a way to increase the chances of that. Okay, so finishing up on the motivational dip, there are things you can do here to help the way you think about your work. First of all, if you understand that there's going to be a motivational dip, you can predict when it will be. And if it's a quick brief between here and Friday, you know when that's going to happen and you can put things in place to improve it. But much more importantly, well, on long-term client relationships, you can view this line here as being, say, 3 years long. And you can look at next year and your relationship with a massive client like Telefonica or something and say, right, I reckon, looking at the overview of this account, there's going to be a motivational dip around about next April. So I'm going to put a set of measures in place to make sure that we've attended to that in February, March, so that the dip doesn't happen, or when it does, it's less troublesome. Okay, I'm moving on now to a point about perspectives. And this is the thing we call zoom in and zoom out. Now, this is one of the greatest challenges that any leader, and certainly a chief exec in a business, will ever come across. And this is the dilemma. How do you cope with the big picture and the detail all at the same time, all day, every day? And the reason this is a big problem is that on the one hand, senior people need to have a broad horizontal view of the entire business, if at all possible, big picture. But on the other hand, it's a disaster when they are caught out by technical specialists or are totally unaware of something specific happening right down lower in the business. And they can get caught out at any time in both directions. So for example, if I spend all day as a chief exec just doing the big picture, then I look daft when I don't understand what's happening in a specific area of my company. On the other hand, if I spend my entire time down in the weeds here, then I'm not thinking about the big picture, so I'm not doing my job as a leader. And that is a dilemma that goes on all day, every day. Now, a related point, and some of you may have heard about T-shaped people and why they're so valuable to businesses, to quickly explain, is that the vertical shaft of the T is to represent a specific vertical discipline or area of expertise that somebody's got. And it's particularly the case in the tech companies where somebody's an engineer or a coder or analyst or something really specific here. The question is then that when they get to the top, have they got the breadth of scope and vision to operate across the crossbar of the T like this? If they have, then they're T-shaped, and that's brilliant. And where it gets really complicated, and this is almost like a working theory that I've put in the book, but it's my suggested theory of, unfortunately, what people have to do these days, is to be almost like a fine-tooth comb. In other words, in my analogy, you've got to cover so much in, let's say, media, however many, I call them touch points, don't they? Technical information, you need to know just enough about all of these tiny things so that you aren't caught out by people within reason. Although it's important to say, it's okay to say, I don't know because I know a technical specialist. So it's really hard, this, but what works is constantly reviewing both big and small, and what doesn't work is only thinking big or only concentrating on the detail. Okay, I'm just going to pick up on what Tony has said in the bar here. Interesting to forecast people's emotions. Not thought of that before. Hey, mate, there you go. Emotional intelligence. Reminds me of something a mate told me once after doing a CBT course. You need to map out people's feelings if you want to get them to do or change their behaviours, not just map out the things they need to do. That's really nice. And that is why Tony is a top strategist. Thanks, Tony. Brilliant. Right, I'm just going to do the fifth one, and then we'll take a little short set of questions and chat for whatever people want to discuss. Now, those of you who know me will know that I do love a market map, and here's a market map. If we had time and we were running an all-day thing, we'd get the old board out now and just draw, and we'll do a bunch of markets. Sadly, I've got to move on faster than that, but you can do. And by the way, you can do this right here just put a little board up and do it right here. And it adds quite a lot of dynamism to what could otherwise just be an online set of slides. That's for another day, but I do produce little videos on things like that if people want to look at them. Anyway, to be brief on this one, it's really easy as a thinker to get clarity and direction just from doing a market map. So my definition of a market map is 2 axes. And you choose a couple of parameters that are relevant to the brand, the market, the category, whatever it is. And then you start plotting where brands in that category sit. And life gets really interesting then. And the moment you do that, you find that you can't actually draw things on the chart unless you have a view. So the moment you say, right, in this market, let's say we do cars, Volvo, good brand quality or not, good price or not, good fuel economy or not, good eco credentials or not, whatever the parameters are. And the moment you discuss those with a colleague, and you can do this online, you're immediately having a strategic discussion about where on earth you place this brand. And by the time you've done it, you build up some sort of map. Now, sometimes a map's really confusing. It's pretty rare that you get one that's got all this going on, but there's a few interesting things that you can learn from it. One is beware. If you have a white space like this, a quadrant where nothing's going on, strategists are often really tempted to say, aha, there's a gap in the market. Yes, but is there a market in the gap? And so the first question you should ask yourself once you see a gap is, what does everybody else in the market know that I don't? And why is it that nobody's there? Because chances are it's not a good place to be. But broadly speaking, when pitching, and you can read all other books and see other presentations I've done on this, you will find that your clients and your brands tend to loll around down here in the doldrums. Otherwise, they wouldn't be asking you to pitch or asking you to propose ideas. And so you want to get them going in this direction here. This is your suggested line of travel. A quick point on east versus west. We happen to write left to right in the east. So everything seems to want to go in this direction, heading right. And of course, because of financial projections, everybody wants things to go up. So you want to be going to the right and up. Unless you're presenting in Dubai, Arabic goes the other way round. So you're going to want to go this way. And if you're presenting in Japan, you've got no chance, because not only do they go backwards, but they go up and down as well. But that's a whole different course and thing to discuss. Okay, so that's my quick first 20-minute blast on that. And there's a quick summary. It's just a very quick way. In the book, if anyone wants a physical copy of the book, by the way, just direct message Rosie and we'll get your home address and we can post the book for people who want them. Because as you can see here, get people to draw your thoughts here once you've had some of these little provocations. So I'm going to have a swig of water and just ask people now, is there anything you'd like to chip in or have a quick chat about before I move on to some ideas for planning?
I've got, so the second point really spoke to me because I'm a kind of, I'll turn my video on, sorry, it's quite interstitial. I'm probably more of a cynic than I am a cheerleader.
Yeah.
And so I've occasionally, I tend to try and spot challenges at the beginning so that I can overcome them rather than trying to like see them along the way. And occasionally, because of the kind of prevailing winds of agencies, that's out of step with everyone else. And so I guess the question is, how do you manage that in an agency where everyone thinks differently?
That's really hard, isn't it? Because you've got a whole character point there. But thank you for confessing that you're a cynic. I'm a bit of a cynic. It's a really hard balance to carry off, because if you're constantly sort of carping on the edges of something, you just come across as a sort of naysayer, and people don't like it. But on the principle that you've got to be true to yourself, you believe, otherwise you go absolutely nuts. I think you should try to find, and I'm sure you do, find smart ways of saying, I don't think that's going to work, or I think we're being economical with the truth about this, but I can think of perhaps a better way of doing it, or have we considered this? But it's really quite a tricky juggling act. In a nutshell, I would say it never really works to be the person who says, well, that's not going to work, and just leave it like that.
Yeah.
Because that's just idea killing. But if you can marry that sharp observation with, and here's a potential better way, then you can be brilliant.
Yeah.
There may be, and I don't know, things to consider in relation to bosses and colleagues, because you could have a truth session with some of them saying, do you find it annoying that I point out these flaws, these stages, but can I help in different ways? And that type of conversation, but potentially have such a conversation not when there's a crisis going on or an argument happening, but at a different time when there is no specific pressure on something. That you could talk about it as a means of working rather than a specific argument, if you like, about how to approach something when it's actually needing to be done.
Yeah.
Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it does. I think it's a build on something I try to do anyway. But yeah, no, I think that's really useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We can pursue it more at the end if you want to. Okay, so thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the next bit, which is rapid observations on planning. Now, of course, the word planning means lots of different things, and particularly in comms, there's thousands of types of planning. Because obviously these books are written for a broad audience, in other words, not just comms, and I happen to come from that area. Here I'm talking about the broadest principles of how do you plan what you're going to do. And it's a fascinating area because when I started in business, to give you a daft example, most people would say of a brand or you or the agency, what's your 10-year plan? And of course, if you say that now, people think you're absolutely mad. 10-year plan? Well, that came down to 5-year plan, which came down to 3-year plan. And now you're lucky if you can have a 1-year plan or even a plan for this afternoon. Everything moves so fast. So let's think around some of those topics and see where we get to. Now, the first thing that I tend to talk about is what you might call the deception of fictional plans. Now, what I mean by this is the more beautifully art directed and comprehensive a plan looks on a wall or on a chart, the more people get deceived into believing that that's actually what's going to happen, which is cobblers, because it's not. And everyone knows it's not really, but everyone goes along with it and no one mentions that the king's got no clothes on. So I guess a little question in the sidebar is, what is the longest amount of time that anybody has ever spent planning a thing? And I'd be fascinating to know. I'll give you a quick example. It's not uncommon for many of my clients and the agencies, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but this is what they do, is to start the planning process for the next year in August, which means that the planning and the budgets is taking up 5 months, and sometimes those budgets are not even approved in January or Feb. So you've lost more months out of that fiscal. So in a way, the business has spent about half a year planning, but not doing. So if you've got any examples of sheer length of that, I'd be fascinated. But also, I'd be fascinated if people have got any examples of beautifully art-directed, lovely, lovely, lovely plans, which make everybody think, great, that's great. Look, we've done the planning. There it is. There's the plan. That's going to happen. But it doesn't happen. So the boxer Mike Tyson once famously said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And there was another quote from General Patton, one of the US famous generals, who said, a plan rarely survives first contact with the enemy. In other words, you can plan as much as you like, but everything may change as soon as you start to try to enact. And so what we tend to recommend these days is a form of rolling iterative planning that does not pretend that everything will go exactly as you think it's going to go. So a way of looking at that is to say, do not waste months and months and months or weeks or whatever it is in relation to the length of the project, planning all this stuff to the nth degree, because it probably won't happen like that. You can map it out once, but relatively fast. And then probably what you'll want to be doing is iterative planning. And so you implement the first bit and you've already built in an area where you know that you're going to review whether that thing is achieving what you want it to achieve. And if it's not, you move on to the next bit and then the next bit and so on. So really this is taking a sequential pattern rather than, yeah, this is all known about already and it's all stacked up. And really, you could look at it like this. It's a kind of wiggle, but then you do get there. So it looks more uncertain, but it does get there eventually. So it's a form of, if you like, not fooling yourself or indeed the business or the brand or your colleagues or whoever. If you assume the plan won't happen, that's a better way of looking at things than assuming that it will. And that's not supposed to be pessimistic, it's supposed to be realistic. So shout if you want to comment on that. So the next thought is to do with pacing, and it's something that I call the year that never is, and I will explain. If you imagine that this line here, the grey one, is next year, and it goes from Jan all the way through to December here. And what pretty much every company, every finance department, every FD, even the chief exec will say is, or maybe group says it, essentially, yeah, we did that last year, so now I want you to do that plus choose a percentage, 10%, something like that. And that's standard stuff. And as the old joke goes, as soon as you achieve the impossible for your boss, they simply add it to your regular list of duties. In other words, as soon as you hit the 10% extra that you're supposed to hit last year, you'll now be asked to hit another 10% next year. And that cycle never stops. I'm just going to have a quick glance here at what's going on here. So Tony says, I like this. This year I've come across the labels deliberate versus emergent strategy or planning, which I think refer to these two types. Excellent, yes. Deliberate sounds quite fixed and quite assumptive in as much as I definitely believe that's going to happen, brackets, and I might not change my view ever. Whereas emergent is exactly that. You've got the humility, if you like, to develop your ideas as you go along rather than just saying, no, we're sticking to the plan. So I like that. I'm just going to shout out Dom's point here. I've spent hours fiddling and making decisions, fearful of the ramifications of getting it wrong and being held to something that turns out to be nonsense. There you go. It feels like that time would have been better spent reframing the plan to the client to say, this is something that we'll be updating as we go. Yes to that. And if you think about it, that is a really good coping strategy, both for individuals and entire agencies and account teams. Because the fallacious thinking that says, there's the plan, and that's exactly what's going to happen, lays everybody open to having the client and anyone else who wants to look at it say, well, you said that was going to happen, but it didn't happen. To which the reasonable answer is, well, that's life. Of course. You can't predict this stuff. Not really. You can think cleverly about it. But if you think it's definitely going to happen, you could set yourself up for a fall, essentially. So yeah, that's really nice. Thanks, Dom and Tony. So returning to this point here, if you think logically about the year or a span of time, it's really much easier than you think. And I even did this with some students in Havas Media School last week, saying, here's the year from January to December. Can we realistically predict when the company will be really firing on all six or, frankly, a bit below par? And everybody can do it and end up with a line that looks like this. The grey line across here is essentially what you might call standard, decent performance. We're doing what we should be doing and it's all working okay. But interestingly, and the students will tell you this, anyone will tell you this, it's just life observation, is down here. In January, we haven't really got going properly. Bit of a hangover from Christmas, turn of the year, etc. We're not really firing on all six. And it may be, it will go up a bit. We probably go up and get some stuff going on the spring because there's a bit more momentum going on there. But then something will drop away. There's 2 bank holidays in May and people lose it. The sun comes out. So we probably won't be as diligent there. But then we'll have another burst of something there. But then in the summer, oh God, we got June, July, August holidays, this and that and the other. Everyone's standing in the sun, drinking outside the pub. And then, we've got a back to school area here. Suddenly in September, October, it all needs to happen again to finish up the year well. And then by about November, everyone's got flu or they're in the pub. So you can predict this, and it's not supposed to be sort of facetious. But in other words, it is a misnomer for any company or FD or anyone doing a financial projection to assume that the company is going to be delivering correctly and appropriately every day of every month of the year, because it's just not going to happen. So instead, you can end up with something like this. We're going to have some crises and some dips here, here, and here, and here. Let's plan for those. And we're going to have some bursts here, here, and here. Let's plan for those. And this is something that agencies are often not very good at. If you knew that this was going to be happening here, then you might hire or tee up X number of freelancers here rather than here. And it's just a way of checking the flow of your business. So there's more to that. And you can look at the diagrams book for more detail, but that's the gist of it. I'm suggesting to planners in particular, please anticipate these work fluctuations and don't assume that you'll have even effort across the entire project or indeed an entire working year. Okay, now let's do the whole essay crisis and have a little bit of fun. Most people have gone to college because you're all jolly, intelligent, lovely people. And this is your essay crisis when you're a student. Let's say you've got a week to do your essay and you get the brief here. You've got a week and you do absolutely bugger all for 6 days, nothing at all. And then there's a mad flap at the end. And in the old days, this was the entire student base of a particular course rushing into the library to try and get access to the only one book on the topic that existed. And it's all a mess like this. Now, the interesting thing is that when people go into comms, they do not get taught how to work properly in relation to this sequence. If you trained as an engineer, an architect, an accountant or something like that, then you would have this habit beaten out of you. But it doesn't happen in comms. What happens in comms is that people go in, become a trainee, become an exec, become an account director, become a something director, move up the board, and eventually they're chief exec. They're still working like this. They're still pitching, flapping at the last minute. Now, obviously, we should be working like this. And when we look at this culturally, what we often find is that this line represents a UK company launching a product. We're launching. Oh shit, mad panic at the end. Whereas if this were in the East, for example, Japan, they would do all the hard thinking at the beginning, then with a smooth run to execution. Now, if you really want to get your pitching and your thinking correctly done, the moment you get a brief, and certainly in the case of a pitch, convene all the people that matter in the first 24 hours and do this. Nut it out in a candid truth session, and you'll probably be about 80% right. You can then set direction to get all your colleagues, executives, and so forth, getting you the information you need to prove your point. If by any chance you discover something hideous here that shows that you're completely wrong, you do have time to course correct, whereas in this method, you don't. Now, it's hilarious sometimes when I present this type of philosophy, if you like, to people, and they'll say, well, I can't do that. I can't work like that. Why is that? Oh, well, because I've got that crisis there. And no sooner have I put that fire out when another one comes along, and then another, and then another, and another. Well, now, if you take that to its logical conclusion, what you're describing is a working life like this here. In other words, it's in permanent crisis. Now, for the individual, this is a complete disaster. No individual will keep this up. There will be stress, there will be illness. It's just not going to continue. Even more importantly, if you talk to a chief exec and it becomes apparent that the working pattern in their company is permanently like this, we can immediately predict that this company is not being a particular success. In fact, in some cases, it could be loss-making, and in many cases, they have a very, very low margin. There'll be stress issues, there'll be staff churn issues, and so on. This is not a permanent state of affairs, how to run a company. So there's a responsibility on all senior people to try to work like this. And there are 2 or 3 suggested ways here, which you can read up and think about, but upfront thinking built in. Essentially, you could make it mandatory company policy to do proper thinking before all major projects or work cycles or whatever, like this. Another way to do it is think, then delegate. In this example here, if you like, the strategy body or the people determining the direction of, let's say, this pitch or project, decide it here, and then they delegate people to support and enhance that line of argument rather than the other way around. A lot of companies fall into the trap, and I've seen this a lot, particularly with media owners, funnily enough, whereby they are so intent to make sure that what they propose is absolutely accurate and spot on, that instead of working out what they want the direction to be and then proving the point, they say, well, I need evidence, and said, oh, fuck. And then half the time they get right to the end and think, I can't formulate my point of view because I haven't had everybody else's point of view or all the information. But unfortunately, that leads to a permanent state of crisis. So I suggest that you do it the other way around. Trust your instincts, your experience, and your technical colleagues. Set the direction. You'll be 80% right. Then you can have a smooth run to executing it really well. Okay, right, I'm going to make 2 more points now, then we'll take a load of chat and question and so forth, and then we'll be finishing up by the midday mark. Now, this is a bit more of an ethereal point, but it's the distinction between deadlines and what I call live lines. This is a word that I invented for reasons unknown many years ago. Now, the interesting thing about what you might call deadline psychology is that in every project or thing in the world, there's always a deadline that someone decrees. It's got to launch on this date, this has to happen, it's a tangible thing. And the interesting thing is that a deadline is actually incredibly short. I mean, it could be, I'm just going to press a button and that thing is launched, and that took 2 seconds. Or even if it's a car that has taken Ford 3 years to develop, it may only have a launch day, just one thing at the motor show, and it's all over in, say, 2 hours. So the temporal deception here, if you like, is that the deadline is really short, but all the work that comes before it, what I call the live line, could be incredibly long and detailed and complicated. And yet, weirdly, people spend inordinate amounts of time flapping around saying, oh, we've got to launch on the 1st of April, we've got to launch on the thing. Yes, but what are all the important bits that go beforehand? Now, one way to look at all the chunks and bits that need to go in here, apart from conventional planning, is to have a look at them with regard to energy levels. And I found this quite interesting. This is a thing that Scott Belsky came up with once. So the reason's a little plus mark here is high energy required to get these things done. But a way of categorizing them, for example here, is to categorize your projects, the pieces, the elements, into extreme, high, medium, low, or indeed idle. And then decide, okay, how do we set priority? Do we actually have the energy to do this? This is almost, it's a mixture between attitude and enthusiasm and pure resource allocation. Do we have enough bodies to get this thing done? And if the answer is no, well, it's not going to happen then, which is a bit like the previous point about planning, which is there's no point in putting a thing on a plan that you think is improbable or unlikely to happen. So don't do it. So once you've done this sifting, if you like, what you may conclude is, anything that we think can fall into the idle box, the question is, well, should we do it at all? Because if it can sit idle, don't do it. Or you can temporarily displace it and say, okay, we're going to do this thing with high energy in January, and we'll do that one in Feb and so on. But it's a different way of working out what you're going to concentrate on. So a bit more abstruse that, but the suggestion is that you concentrate on the live current work and don't panic and flap about the deadline. Just organise yourselves accordingly. Okay, finally then, this is all about precision, and it's just a little tricksy mnemonic really, but it comes out of good, decent thinking, some of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. I had a boss once who said, oh, I think you'd be better off concentrating on the donut rather than the hole, which took me a bit of time to work out, but I think I knew what he meant. Anyway, so we need to work out when we're planning, what should we really focus on? And the interesting thing, and for all of those of you who've read Simon Sinek's Start With Why book, and I'm sure a lot of you have, is that for years and years and years, companies, whole companies, would know what they do and they would know how they do it, but they wouldn't actually have answered the question, why? Why do we do this? And so, sorry, that happens with a cursor sometimes. The interesting thing is to do it the other way around and say, right, why do we do this? And spend as much time as you need on doing that, because until you've worked that out, the rest of it doesn't really matter. Then you will relatively easily work out the how and the what in a different sequence. So this is linked to purpose and the precision of what you're thinking about. There's another thing that you can do, and you can look at it with regard to time. And there's a guy called Max McEwen, really good bloke, who's written many books actually, but this one is from a book called #Now. And the point he's making is this. Here's a Venn diagram which has the past here and the future here and #now in the middle right now. And the interesting thing is lots of people spend a lot of time harking on about the past. And even though you think that's like sort of old-fashioned old gits going on talking about, oh, it wasn't like that in my day. That isn't really the point. The point is that if you think about the amount of energy that companies spend looking at competitive reviews and post-mortems and all this stuff, there's a huge industry almost in all of this past stuff. But what we're only really interested in is the future. And the only place you can influence the future is right now. And that's what Max means by #now. And that, if you can define your temporal now, that is a really interesting thing to do. The final little amusing or little mnemonic to help people focus on their stuff is a thing they call NEMO. And in this, we're imagining a target with a bullseye in the middle. And the mnemonic is nothing else matters except the O, which is the bullseye of the target, NEMO. In other words, this is the sole thing which we need to concentrate on for this brief, this campaign, this project, this strategy, this anything. When you're leading, when you're setting direction, cut out all the clutter and just do that thing really well, okay? Trying to do everything doesn't work. Now, there's stacks of other stuff in the book. You've got a PDF of that. You can have a hard copy if you would like one, but that's in essence just a short, sharp, bite-size 1 hour of provocations for you. So anybody want to chip in and shout? There's a whole blog that goes behind this and there's videos and all sorts. So if you want to have a look at theintelligentworkbook.com. So we've got 5 minutes left if we want it. So anybody want to fire in some comments or ask a particular question, just fire away.
The one thing, Kevin, thanks very much for that, Tony.
Yes,
just
hi.
a comment, I suppose, which is, it's quite refreshing when you're talking about that. I just find it's such a bloody obvious thing, but to just engage your brain and think.
Yes.
And that you don't, yes, of course, you can go back as that bit about the past. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely guilty. I mean, I'm guilty of a lot of the stuff that you've said there. But you do, it's very, I've being quite sort of black and white about things. My temptation is always to sort of go and I can't get an opinion until I've gone and found out everything I can possibly find out about this thing. And only then will I be able to. And forgetting the fact that actually you can draw on your own instincts and you can form hypotheses and you can do those really quickly. Particularly if you've got, as we all have, a smart bunch of people around you who are familiar with the category or the problem or the thing, and just to sort of engage your brain. It just struck me. I probably don't spend enough time just allowing myself to have a think about what I think. I sort of get stuck into trying to sort of almost this sense that there's like an answer. I've got to go and find it rather than rather than try and work it out.
Yeah, and don't beat yourself up for that because it's
no.
It's a natural instinct for all thinkers, planners, strategists. But my broad message to you, and I'm pleased that struck a nerve, and it is what I would call thinking about thinking.
Yeah.
Because actually, the way you earn your living, and most agencies do really, is thinking, in a different way about a task which the client technically is incapable of solving themselves. Yeah. Now, so it's really fascinating because at the core of this is what I would simply call confidence. Now, if you are confident, and all you good people, if you are broadly confident that you are competent and that you know pretty much broadly enough, and you've seen a lot of this stuff before, we often used to say there's only 6 strategies in the world, so which one do you want to use today, then take that high level of confidence and say, based on my experience, I reckon it's probably one of these. Respected colleague on the team, what do you think? Yes, no, compare, quick refinement. Okay, we reckon it's pretty much one of these. Great. We've just saved ourselves 3 weeks of soul searching on something where we pretty much knew what we were going to recommend anyway, because we're really actually quite good. And if you can get to that stage in your head and with your teams, obviously without being arrogant, it's just massively liberating. It saves you thousands of man and woman hours of work, and everybody's happier and more confident. And
it's good.
To build on that a bit, I totally agree. And what I noticed while you were speaking, Kevin, was those diagrams that have the wiggly line at the start and then the flat line after and the other
Yeah.
one. I think in my experience, we're much, much better at delivering early on wiggly line, flat line on pitches than we are in our day-to-day clients, because you have check-ins immediately on a pitch, the really senior people straight away, and you need to have an hypothesis and something you're running towards. And I think actually we let ourselves off the hook a bit too much with day-to-day clients. We don't do that. And we think we have the time, everyone knows what they're doing, off you go. But actually, if we had a bit more of that regimented, what are we going to do in the first few days, I think that would actually really help our day-to-day working lives. And it works well in pitches. So it's funny that we just sort of, well, personally, work in a different way.
Yeah, no, I empathise with that as well. I know what you mean. It feels sometimes very, very different, doesn't it? I mean, client by client can vary, but sometimes the experience of a pitch is fundamentally different to a normal day-to-day life. You're right.
Well, and it feels uncomfortable at the time. It feels like, oh, we're getting to the idea way too early. Oh my God. But actually, then you're right, Kevin. 80% of the time, you do end up going with that idea, and it is the right one. So yeah, confidence early on. I'm all up for that. I think we can start looking at how we do that on our clients. So thank you.
Well, it's a really interesting point you make, Rebecca, and it was occurring to me there, the difference in mentality and psychology that an agency and the team is demonstrating with regard to whether you're pitching or whether you're working on an existing client relationship. And you put your finger on it there, because when you're pitching, you're not yet appointed, and you are liberated, if you like, to have your point of view, and you are mini obsessed in a short compressed period of time to be distinctive so that you get appointed. Therefore, your thinking is intrinsically braver, probably, and time is compressed. As soon as you've got a client, and particularly if you've had the client for several years, it all slips into a kind of languid rhythm. They think they own you to a degree because they've appointed you and they're paying you. So they're more inclined to err on the side of telling you more prescriptively what to do, which gives additional pressure on the agency to say, well, I know you've told us for that, or you've asked us for one of those, but in our experience, we wouldn't recommend it. We recommend you do X. And it's that moment when you can save yourself hours of heartache and engender way more pride in the teams and in yourself as an individual, because then you are indeed a respected advisor rather than just the passive recipient of a bunch of instructions.
Couldn't be nodding more over here, Kevin. Couldn't be nodding more. Yeah, exactly.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And so I'm delighted, thank you, that you've picked up on these things. And you're right, Tony, it does sound incredibly simple and straightforward, but one way or another, you'll just get so busy, you just forget to think about thinking.
Yeah, we were, funny enough, that the point you just articulated just then is I was talking about, Hannah, I think, has left now, but we were talking about that this morning, because my sense is, and I honestly have no idea if it's just us trying to draw a pattern out of a small number of instances that I just happen to have been exposed to in the past month.
Yeah.
But in certainly 3 cases of clients I'm aware of, we've tried to give a point of view and have effectively just been sort of told what to do, sort of butted up very, very quickly against, and they're all different circumstances, right? So one is there's parts of the business that have just got a very strong voice and they're not within the marketing department, but they govern how things happen. There's another client that's got very strong regional center and they effectively dictate guidelines and rules, and never can you cross them, and you know. And there's another one where they seem sort of scatty, but they sort of take on a lot of the media decisions themselves and sort of do. It's just, I just wonder that we were talking earlier on as to whether or not that is a pattern that is emerging. Is it emerging out of current circumstances? Am I generalizing out of just too small a bunch of examples? But I just think, given a trend around things like in-housing at a dramatic sense, I suppose, which would be clients been making those decisions, through to just, I don't know, the sort of the perennial thing that media agencies sometimes butt up against of being, a tactic
Yeah.
at the end of a series of, I don't know whether there's something going on with it.
Well, it's hard for me to comment on whether it's a pattern.
Yeah, no, sure.
Almost
Me
impossible.
too.
But contributory factors definitely will be the strength of culture and purpose at the agency. Put simply, and I'm not saying it's true at your place, but put simply, if a chief exec says, actually, the client comes first and whatever they want, we give them, then the rest of the workforce is stuffed because you've got no air cover. That principle applies at every level. So, everyone below you, the moment someone says, yes, it's okay, bang, you're subservient. So now, in extreme cases, and I do not believe this for 1 second of Havas, if that were a cultural trait and it just pertained all the time, then obviously you're in the wrong agency. But I'm not suggesting that of Havas. The other thing that can go on is that clients can get into a kind of whipping boy mentality where they just want to say, do this, do that. And that can happen for all sorts of psychological reasons. It could be that they have a somewhat toxic dictatorial culture. It can also be just one marketing director who wants to kick stuff around and prove a point, in which case it can come from one personality, not the whole corporation. There can also be marketing arrogance, whereby people think we know what we want, and that can lead them to being highly prescriptive with regard to saying, do me an X. But it can even get as prescriptive as, we've decided we need a Facebook campaign. To which you say, well, that's interesting, because we're your media advisors. What are you trying to achieve commercially? And now we'll advise you. In other words, they stampede to the medium because they think it sounds trendy. For example, there's hundreds of reasons. And what you could do is a little post-mortem on all of those and discuss with your colleagues, do we think this is a trend or a one-off? And are we prepared to do anything about it? And I always say, particularly to more junior people, if you've got an issue like that, get hold of the most senior person on your side and tell them about it. You go up and up the chain and escalate it as far as possible until somebody really senior says, no, just do it anyway.
And it's fair. It's a good point, because they are the three instances I'm talking about are all undoubtedly different things. They're not. It's not all the same thing.
Right.
So the context, whilst the sort of the end result to some extent is similar, the drivers are no doubt are undoubtedly different. But that's a useful thing actually. It's probably useful now coming into the back end of the year, as going back to the thing you were talking about, looking ahead to next year. There's lots of annual plans have been drawn up. It probably would be a useful exercise to reflect on how that process has gone and what some of the chops and changes have been and how it's landed. I think that's probably useful. I've not done that before, but again, probably broadly to reflect on things would be a good thing.
Yeah, worth a go, and you can do it simply and fast and see if it helps you and your colleagues.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I see obviously one or two people have had to dash off, as we know, in a world of back-to-back calls. Soon as it was midday, some people said, sorry, gotta go. And that's been happening a little bit in the chat bar. But personally, I'm happy to sit around and chat a bit more if people want to. I see we're down to Rebecca, Tony, Abby and Lucy are still there. Abby and Lucy, if you can hear me, do you want to say anything at all? Just want to check.
I literally just messaged you, Kevin. I did your Achieve training back in the day at Cara, and it was such a game changer for me then. But I've just found this so helpful, because kind of what Rebecca was saying about we're inherently at agencies, we just do stuff so last minute. I'm just I work with Rebecca on O2, and it's just
do you? Right. I thought I recognised that name, Abby. Right, yeah. So Tick Achieve at Cara in the last century sometime. Yeah.
Ages ago.
That's
yeah,
brilliant.
it's really interesting. Like Rebecca, I see your team do a lot of the work up front. It's really funny coming from planning.
Yeah.
I see probably how you guys approach stuff differently to probably how you see us do it. But actually, it is just kind of like up and down the whole time, isn't it? On O2?
Well, it's difficult though, isn't it, Abby? Because your team are waiting on lots of other people's work, which takes time to come through. So it's really hard for you guys to get everything done as early as we can sometimes. So it's the nature of your department, unfortunately. But yeah, we can always talk about how we can find ways to make that easier.
But also, I think it also leads into some of that, just having the 3 good things and the 3 bad things, and actually
Yeah.
we just don't acknowledge the bad things enough. Sometimes we're like, oh yes, we can do this is really good, whereas actually we know EE are gonna absolutely smash it. And
Yeah, I think that's my biggest takeout from this is that, or one of them, the 3 good and 3 bad, because we do really detailed feedback to client briefs, often collated from other agencies, and it'll just be a Word doc of a million questions for them. Poor bastards, sorry. But if we just not instead, but as well at the top said, our 3 things that we're most concerned about and our 3 things that we're most enthusiastic about, I think that'd be a really nice way into, and also here are lots of questions that we need you to answer. But it's a really nice idea. I really like that, and I think we should take that on O2, definitely. So thank you.
And what I like about that is it, for me, anything that helps simplify, because often you get a brief which is far too long but no information. Great ability that clients have. That, and actually quite often I find our role, or my role, is to just help simplify and boil it down to the key points, and often sometimes those 3 bad points, actually those are the things that you actually need to address, and that's actually where the strategy needs to hang off from, is how do you address those sort of negative barrier points. Because, and I think we often forget our role as consumers ourselves. Like, we are consumers of most categories at some point in our life, so actually us being able to trust our instinct, why wouldn't I buy that product? And then obviously we need to make sure we're not just that translates as well to the wider audience as well. But if we start with that instinct and those 3 good points and 3 concerns, and then go a bit deeper, I think that could help come to some quite interesting territories quite quickly.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And of course, there is an inherent psychology in most clients, which we often laugh about, but it's actually no laughing matter. And that is, there's almost no client in the world that doesn't have an over-exaggerated sense of how rather brilliant their product is.
Yeah.
You know, as a basic start point, they are thinking, I've got to justify to my partner why I get up in the morning and drive my crappy Ford Sierra to go and market whatever the hell the thing is. So intrinsically, they have to convince themselves that their product is brilliant. So it'll be overinflated. So every time you get a brief, it will have a degree of hubris and overclaim in it, which all needs debunking before you can even get to work. And it's really difficult to get the balance because, as I think Don was saying earlier, if you go straight in and say, oh, for fuck's sake, you know, that's not right, that's useless, you're actually sixth in the market, you know, this is totally fanciful, then you're probably going to get fired. But on the other hand, it's your strategic duty to point out that the king's got no clothes on and this is a better way of looking at things. It's hard.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating because I've suddenly, sort of noticed that as we're having this after chat here, we've got a whole bunch of thoughtful strategists thinking, yeah, this is what we grapple with all day. So
you've got strategists remaining on the call. We're all 3 of us are strategists.
Yeah, this is what's happening. So what I would mention to you is a few things to help. First of all, I do stacks with Havas. So there are all sorts of courses and things and topics. But equally, there are blogs and books and all sorts of resources, and you can just have them for free. Plus, I'm here. So if you want any help, I've been working with Havas for so long, you know, it's 5 years now or something. If you've got a whole presentation or a tricky problem with a client or anything, just give us a call or email or whatever, and just try and help out.
That's lovely, Kevin. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Duncan, then. Thank you, Duncan. No. That's a really kind offer. Thank you. I'll definitely bear that in mind.
Yeah, let's link in, stay in touch, you know, ping me any difficulties you've got and we'll just try and make it better.
Lovely.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, Tony, lovely to see you, mate. Thank you.
You too, and thanks Rosie as well for your help. Thank you.
Guys,
Thank you.
yeah,
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rebecca. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
That's actually really fascinating, and it's so funny because the issues just haven't changed.
I know. I
They're
better.
the same things. It's the same stuff.
I'm going to stop recording now, I think.
Oh yeah, good idea.